When the professor pointed at Barron Trump and made a sarcastic remark, the entire lecture hall chuckled. No one expected much from the quiet young man sitting in the back. But when he stood up and spoke, clear, composed, and armed with flawless constitutional knowledge, the room fell silent. A law professor lost control of his own classroom, and the crowd watched as the student he tried to belittle ended up stealing the show. That day, it wasn't the name Trump that spoke loudest, it was the strength behind it. Friday afternoons at NYU School of Law were usually uneventful. Quiet seminar rooms, tired students, and professors wrapping up the week with theoretical discussions. But that day something shifted. Something, or rather, someone, changed the entire atmosphere the moment he walked in. He wasn't announced. No media, no bodyguards. Just a tall, composed young man in a fitted navy blazer and dark jeans. His presence calm but unmistakable. His name wasn't called out until roll was taken, but a few students had already recognized the familiar features, the distinct poise, and yes, the surname. Trump, Professor Jonathan Harris said, pausing mid-sentence. The name seemed to echo in the lecture hall like a challenge. Barron didn't flinch. He looked up from his notebook and nodded once, silently. Professor Harris was known for his brilliance, but also for his sharp tongue and unapologetically progressive stance. For years, he had made it a habit to mock the Trump administration during lectures, often turning political commentary into classroom jokes. So when he realized the youngest Trump was in his seminar, he couldn't resist. With a slight smirk, he leaned forward on the podium. "Mr. Trump," he said loudly, "since your family has had such a complicated relationship with the Constitution, perhaps you'd like to define freedom of expression for us?" Laughter echoed through the room. Phones were already out. Some students recorded discreetly, anticipating a viral moment. Others exchanged knowing looks, some amused, some uncomfortable. It was clear that the professor wasn't interested in a discussion. He was setting the stage for public humiliation. But Barron didn't take the bait. He closed his notebook slowly and stood up, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, just deliberately. The room, now tense with anticipation, went silent. "If this class is truly about free speech," he said calmly, "then I believe I'm entitled to speak." The response was simple, direct. But something in his tone made even the snickering students pause. There was no arrogance in his voice. Just clarity. Strength. Composure. Professor Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Well then, by all means," he said, waving toward the center of the room, "the floor is yours." Barron stepped forward. The moment felt unreal. A presidential son, barely out of his teens, was about to address a classroom full of skeptical peers, a panel of professors, and a man who had just tried to publicly shame him. But instead of striking back, Barron paused, letting the silence speak first. His fingers brushed the edge of the lectern. His eyes scanned the room, not with defiance, but with conviction. What he said next wouldn't just answer a question. It would redefine expectations. And no one, not even Professor Harris, was ready for it. Barron Trump stepped up to the front of the room, not as a celebrity, not as the son of a former president, but as a student ready to speak on his own terms. There was no podium, just a small wooden table and a few steps separating him from the professor who had just attempted to humiliate him. Still, Barron stood straight, composed, letting the room settle into silence before speaking. "When we talk about freedom of expression," he began calmly, "we often reduce it to slogans, protests, and noise. But the First Amendment isn't just about what you can shout in the streets. It's about your right to think freely, even when your thoughts go against the grain." A hush fell over the room. The chuckles from earlier had died off. Phones were still recording, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't the punchline they expected. "Professor Harris," Barron continued, meeting his gaze, "you asked how I would define freedom of expression given my last name. But that's just it. It's not my last name that defines my understanding of freedom. It's the fact that I've had to live with what that name represents, both fairly and unfairly." He paced slightly, but not nervously. He was gathering momentum. "I've been shouted at in airports, mocked in classrooms, assumed to be arrogant, ignorant, or worse, without saying a single word. So believe me, I understand how dangerous it is when we let perception override principle." A few gasps were heard from the back. Even some of the panelists began to lean forward, intrigued. Freedom of expression, he said, pausing for effect, doesn't mean freedom from criticism. But it does mean protection from targeted bias, especially in institutions like this one, where ideas are supposed to be examined, not weaponized. Professor Harris shifted in his seat. And if you're wondering whether I came here to defend my family name, no. I came here to remind this room that every student deserves the right to be heard without having to first justify their last name. He glanced at the screen behind him and tapped on a remote. A slide came up. Tinker v. Des Moines Independent School District, 1969. A 13-year-old girl wore a black armband to protest the Vietnam War. The Supreme Court ruled in her favor, affirming that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. He paused again. I don't wear a black armband. But I carry something just as visible. A name. A history. And I'm here today to reclaim what it means, not to erase it, but to build on it. There was a long silence. Then one student, sitting in the front row, slowly began to clap. Another joined. Then another. The applause grew, not loud or frenzied, but steady and respectful. Professor Harris cleared his throat. Mr. Trump, he said, quieter now, you've made your point. But Barron didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded and returned to his seat, letting the moment speak for itself. As Barron Trump returned to his seat, the clapping slowly faded into a deep, contemplative silence. It wasn't the awkward hush that followed embarrassment, nor the usual lull after a student's speech. This was different. Something in the room had shifted, an invisible line crossed, a perception unraveled. The panel of professors sat quietly, their pens no longer scribbling, their expressions unreadable. Even Professor Harris, who had been so eager to spark a spectacle, now found himself leaning back in his chair, eyes lowered, absorbing a truth he hadn't anticipated. The moderator cleared his throat. Well, I suppose this seminar just took a turn we didn't expect. Thank you, Mr. Trump. Some students chuckled nervously. But Barron didn't look around for approval. He simply nodded, folded his notes, and sat still, as if the most important part of his day had already passed. Word spread quickly. By the end of the day, clips from the classroom were already circulating online. Trump's son silences Harvard professor read one trending headline. Others were more reflective. When character speaks louder than politics. The video racked up millions of views, not because Barron had shouted, insulted, or clapped back with force, but because he hadn't. He had shown that silence, when filled with substance, is louder than any scream. Later that week, Professor Harris published a column in the University Journal. I was wrong. It read plainly in the title. The article was not an apology, but an acknowledgement that brilliance sometimes comes from the least expected corners. That the best answers are often quiet, precise, and unadorned. Barron, on the other hand, never addressed the moment again. He didn't retweet the video, didn't make a public statement, and didn't sit for interviews. He simply continued showing up to class, asking questions, and learning. For him, the moment was never about image. It was about identity. Yet, the ripple effects continued. Students who had previously dismissed Barron as nothing more than a famous last name now greeted him with a nod, or even a smile. Some asked for book recommendations. Others invited him to study groups. Not out of pity, but out of respect. And Professor Harris? He began opening each class with a brief reminder. Challenge the idea, not the person. No one knew where Barron Trump's path would lead after college. Maybe law school. Maybe music. Maybe neither. But everyone in that room knew one thing for certain. He would never again be seen just as a name. He had earned something few ever do in a place like that. He had earned a reputation built not on noise or power, but on clarity, character, and calm. And when people spoke of that day in the seminar hall, they didn't say, remember the time a Trump got roasted by a professor. They said, remember when a young man rewrote the narrative with nothing but truth, preparation, and silence? Some stories remind us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, speaks calmly, and leaves a lasting impact. What Barron Trump did that day wasn't just about knowledge or sharp arguments. It was about standing tall when underestimated, staying calm in the face of arrogance, and letting truth speak louder than titles. If you found strength in his silence, courage in his words, or inspiration in his actions, we invite you to join our growing community. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts below. Because your voice matters, and sometimes the most powerful moments come from the most unexpected people.